Don't worry, of course I'm gonna review John Hopkins and the Glitch Mob. Just, had to take time out of final exam work for this. Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old, and today I'm talking about the new album from Mouse on Mars, Dimensional People. Mouse on Mars is a German IDM/synth-pop duo from Germany, Jan St. Werner and Andy Thoma, and occasionally another vocalist and drummer who I'm not going to pronounce the name of. Now, I've known about these guys for a long time. I hear them in a lot of people's recommendations for electronic music, bands, and artists, related to most of the bands that I typically listen to regularly, but this was my first time actually bothering to listen to any of their stuff. I once again used this video as an excuse to catch up on the Mouse on Mars back catalog, because they were the last Friday the 13th release that I hadn't yet covered, mainly because of that. This is their 11th studio album, as far as I can tell, so that's a pretty sizable back catalog to go through, and we're already starting to get hit by a lot of new releases in the coming months, so yeah, but I felt the need to cover this one given how they are yet another cult favorite 90s electronic act. And I've had a pretty good track record with liking those. That does unfortunately mean that yes, this is yet another outsider perspective review. This video isn't coming from someone who's been a fan of these guys for years, but rather someone who's going into them with fresh eyes. So, without any further ado, let's go down their discography so far. This is a pretty good IDM techno thing with some light, bubbly, melodic sensibilities. It did take me until the second listen to get much of anything out of it, but I did definitely come around on it. Some good stuff to be found here. Not really a fan of the title, though. Okay, this is nice. The lighthearted but still strange and textured style of this album is pretty consistently enjoyable, if not the most unique. Solid stuff. Also, Wolfgang Flür from Kraftwerk is the drummer on the first track here, so that's cool too. Ooh, getting some Mathematics vibes off of this one in some parts. It has fallen into the background more than I'd like. Same with the previous album, to be honest, but there is something here that's connecting, open to this growing on me as well. The more ambient-centric companion to the previous album, similar vibe, but more mellowed out. And also less memorable. I don't see myself coming back to this a lot. I'm told this was initially created as a film soundtrack, but to a film that was never released. I thought it was pretty good, but didn't find it to really get going for me until the second half. Also, maybe a bit disappointing that the track Flim from here has nothing to do with the Aphex Twin track of the same name, but whatever, that was one of the better ones. Ooh, I really like the use of horn sections and other various orchestral elements on this one. Probably my favorite up to this point, though once again it does fall into the background unfortunately easily. Kind of continuation of the previous album, incorporating vocals in a few areas. Possibly even better than the previous as well, but we'll have to see. Speaking of vocals, they really went all in with the vocals on this one. Not to the point where they sound like a different band, mind you, they sound the same, just now with more human voices. I think this newfound focus is helping making it more memorable and sticking with me more, actually, though. I mean, I especially loved the track Send Me Shivers. That one was excellent. Well, now we've gone into some seriously rough, dark, and abrasive territory. Cool for what it is, I guess? Though I do think the idea of the track Ret Phase being a series of 11 tracks, many of which are only like 5 seconds long, I think that's pretty creative. Kind of a mishmash of the last couple of releases, I guess. It's cool too. Which brings us to here. So, before I begin, I will have to freely admit I do not think I've properly gotten the time to process the Mouse on Mars back catalog yet. And it'll probably take me quite a long time for me to be confident in how I feel on them. I mean, all of these albums have stayed at least up around the 7 range, but none of them have crossed into 8 territory yet. They've all been enjoyable, but they so consistently fall into the background. 'Cause the thing is, the band these guys remind me of the most has to be Plaid. Like, those guys took me a while for me to fully love and appreciate what they were doing, since their style was so obtuse and strange, and the melodic and quirky sensibilities provided me with some motivation for me to explore them on a deeper level and listen more, be able to figure them out. Mouse on Mars are very much the same in that regard, except that I've only been listening to them for a few days. They seem to be the kind of band that I will really need to put in time and dedication to fully get into, and I'm not at that point right now at all. Not to mention their sonic similarities to Plaid have been taking away some of that wow factor for me. I have a feeling if I discovered these guys 4 or 5 years ago, I could speak on them with more enthusiasm, but whatever. I wanted to release this video in a semi-timely fashion as well, so I guess I'll just have to leave it at that for now. Anyway, let's get into the new album. Now, admittedly, I'm not sure what the consensus is on this latest album here. I don't really see anyone talking about it, and while it does appear to be there was some initial excitement in the lead up to its release, once it dropped, basically everyone immediately seemed to stop talking about it. I've not gotten any requests to talk about it, maybe because I said I was already going to in like my Chrome Sparks review and got a little bit of enthusiasm for the idea, but I don't know. This one seems to have disappeared off of everyone's radar, which is not a particularly good sign. But hey, well, gotta be worth a shot regardless. There was a pretty interesting selection of guest features as well, including Justin Vernon from Bon Iver, Aaron and Bryce Dessner from The National, Zach Condon from Beirut, blah, 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 Swamp Dogg, and many, many others. Not exactly the type of guests I'd expect for a band like this. It would have to be interesting if nothing else, so how does Dimensional People fare? I'm kinda torn on this thing, to be honest. There are things that work about it, and things that don't. Like, my thoughts on this album are kind of a muddled mess. On one hand, from a pure conceptual level, I love the shit out of this album. It's like a weird blend of their usual experimental and off-the-wall style with elements of basically every other genre in existence. Some jazz, some rock, some hip-hop, even folk and country of all things seems to have a fair bit of focus. Like, there's such a wide blend of instrumentation from horn sections and strings to like steel guitar and fiddle. It's easily the least electronic release they've ever had, although they do, of course, incorporate their odd left-field stylings and electronic sounds as usual, too. On top of that, in order to avoid coming off as a complete mess, they've assembled the album in a particularly tight, continuous mix. I mean, you can see just looking at the track listing how there are tracks with multiple parts, but nearly every track is designed specifically to blend into the next. Even ones that don't specifically note it in the title. In fact, ironically, the only ones that don't blend are the 3 parts of the track Parliament of Aliens. They don't really blend into each other at all, and it's basically just 3 completely separate tracks that have nothing to do with each other. The rest of the album pulls stuff like basically making Daylight and Tear to My Eye indistinguishable from one another and putting a giant intro to the track Sidney in a Cup in the track Resume. Which, you know, I always love me a good continuous mix, though it does have some drawbacks. Like, my first 2 or 3 listens of this thing, my iPod was weirdly skipping the track Resume, and I didn't even notice until the 3rd listen. So, yeah, but I do like continuous mixes anyway, so whatever. Like, on paper, this album sounds incredible and something that would totally be up my alley. I mean, I may not be into folk music, but there are so many interesting instrumental moments that I really enjoyed. And on top of that, the production is pretty consistently solid too. Like, take the title track, for instance. I mean, I wasn't huge on the beginning with the rapidly clicking metronome thing, but just once the live band on there kicks in and it just brings on these jazzy flourishes, and it is awesome. All these live band arrangements are consistently really strong and interesting and textured. Even weaker tracks like Aviation really benefit from this strong instrumental palette. And when the tracks themselves have a strong backbone of enjoyability already, like Daylight and Tear to My Eye, then they become even bigger highlights. And tracks like the 3 parts of Parliament of Aliens, sure, those 3 tracks are related in name only, but they bring the weirdest and among the most interesting and engaging moments on this album. Needless to say, what Mouse on Mars themselves are bringing to the table and the vision they're carrying out is the reason to check this out. But there are also so many freaking issues I have with this album, and basically all my issues come down to the vocal guests, who at best, you know, they complement the track decently well, don't stand out that much, and at worst, actively take away from my enjoyment. There's a lot of bad singing on this thing. A few moments really stick out to me as bad, and could have been salvaged by maybe even removing the guest entirely. The 3rd part of the title track, for instance, Dimensional People Part 3, would have been one of the biggest highlights on this thing, just thanks to the excellent production and instrumentation. Just all the horn sections in the back end of this thing were awesome, but this track is almost ruined by the presence of Justin Vernon, whose froggy falsetto is very difficult to swallow, and I also couldn't understand a single word he was saying. He's not so bad in part 2, like he's just kind of in the background, sort of, but his guest on part 3 was bad. Aviation had Spank Rock, whose scratchy off-key voices kind of brought that track down. They're not the worst on here, though. And on Parliament of Aliens Part 1, you got female singer Lisa Hannigan, she does okay, but you also got Sam Amidon, however you say that. He does not do well on this. He's really off-key and sounds bad, and on top of that, I don't think the voices complement the abstract and experimental vibe of the track well at all. It would have been much more effective if this track were just instrumental. I mean, just look at the other two parts of Parliament of Aliens. Both instrumentals and both much stronger tracks, if not as overtly weird. But I think the worst vocal guest, not necessarily the worst track, but worst guest feature, has to be Swamp Dogg on the track Resume. He just does this, like, spoken word poem thing, which, I guess it's okay, but he bizarrely ends his poem with a shameless plug of a track he made in 1965, which I guess was apparently a big hit in the South at the time, according to him. And the track comes to a dead stop in order to play a slightly modulated sample of the track. What the fuck? Who directly shameless plugs themselves in the middle of someone else's album? I mean, I don't think the track sounded bad, but stopping the album to play it and directly remind people that, hey, I used to be relevant once. It was just such a pathetic and cringeworthy moment. The rest of the track is good enough to make up for that one terrible moment, but still. By the way, please download my Spiral Out of Control album at 256pi.bandcamp.com. Anyways, not all the vocal guests are bad. I did find Zach Condon's contributions to be pretty consistently good. I cannot wait for the comment sections for everyone to correct all the 17 butchered pronunciations I made. Well, I thought this guy singing on Foul Mouth alongside Amanda Blank weirdly reminded of Kendrick Lamar's singing, which is not the kind of thing I would typically highlight for Kendrick, but it certainly sticks out, and not in a bad way. But the best vocal-heavy track, also with Zach Condon, has to be the closer, Sidney in a Cup, which is the closest this album gets to actually being catchy. Kind of this breezy pop-rock kind of track. My eyes, my lips, my nose, my eyes, my lips, my nose. Yeah, I think I'm just gonna have to highlight this fact. As interesting in texture as the album can be, very little of it is actually memorable or catchy. Now, admittedly, this is a problem that permeates through the entire Mouse on Mars back catalog, and I don't think is something they've ever really gone out of their way to accomplish. This particular album is trying more to be weird and experimental than it is trying to stick in your head, so I won't rag on them too hard for this point. But it is maybe kind of telling that the only other track besides Sidney in a Cup that comes off to me as catchy from this album is Parliament of Aliens Part 3. Yes, the 33-second interlude. I mean, I really like the synth and guitar jamming on there. It has a really distinctive sound. The rest disappears from my head immediately after it's done playing. I mean, going back to the Plaid comparison I made earlier, sure, those guys are also pretty frequently guilty of aiming more for weirdness than memorability, but I'm drawn to them more since they do have those occasional tracks like X-Torque or IN that immediately stuck out as catchy. Or heck, on their last album, I remember the tune to tracks like Clock or You Mountain or Do Matter, despite not having listened to that album in well over a year. Of course, this point is also kinda moot since, again, I've listened to Plaid for years and I've only listened to Mouse on Mars for a few days. But it is still an issue I have with them. I felt like it was kind of worth discussing, especially given how they're branded as left-field pop sometimes. From my perspective, I don't know if that's entirely deserved. But I digress. So, overall, Undimensional People. I do think this album in the end does have more good qualities than bad ones, and I certainly can't say I was remotely bored by the experience. I mean, if you're already a fan of Mouse on Mars, this will be a bit of a strange departure, but it'll be one that doesn't lose their core appeal or weirdness. At least I think. For me personally, though, it's a very frustrating album. I mean, it's got a lot of great ideas, beautiful instrumentation and production, good replay value that is allowing it to grow on me more with repeat listens. I've already given it like 7 or 8 listens already. And despite a major departure in sound, it doesn't sound out of character for the band either. But this is also an album that has a lot of subpar or outright unenjoyable guest features, bad singing, and one that frequently comes close to eliciting a strong emotional reaction out of me, but gets undercut too often. I still think I'm going to recommend it regardless, since it is such an interesting album with lots of admirable qualities and discussion material. Like, if you're both a Mouse on Mars fan and a Bon Iver fan, you'll certainly enjoy the hell out of it. I can possibly see the potential for it to grow on me further given the kind of band that Mouse on Mars is, so I won't immediately throw it out as, oh, I'm never going to return to this in the future. I might still, but in the end, I think my reaction to this is very similar to my reaction to that last Meat Beat Manifesto album. Very mixed thoughts, but there is definitely something here. Though this also happens to have stronger highs and much more frustrating lows. It's hard to say, really. Been dancing around with it in my head for a while, but I think it just barely skates by with a solid 7 out of 10. So, yeah. But of course, it's just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.